Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. In this episode, let's look at how music became more heavy, more distorted, and more wild in the decade of the 1960s. Before we get started with the episode, yes, I am working on a new intro, but I'd also like to give a big shout out to so many of the people in the United Kingdom who watched my last video on the groundhogs. Thank you very much for showing me support. I feel a strong connection to the United Kingdom because my parents are from Scotland and moved to Canada. Now, the 60s was the most pivotal decade in terms of cultural change in the post-World War II era. Now, in terms of rock music, pop music, or just like popular music in general, this was a decade of immense change. And one factor was the change in heaviness. So when we're talking about heaviness, I'm looking for something like the distortion in the electric guitar and other factors as well, maybe darker subject matter in music, maybe more intense screams. There's a lot of change that happens here, and it's quite amazing. At the beginning of the decade, we still had the sounds of sort of like the traditional rock and roll, but by the end of the decade of the 1960s, we basically have, like heavy metal and punk in its early forms. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to find songs from each year of the decade, and I'm also going to note some key progressions in sound that happened. I mean, there are so many songs from this decade, particularly the second half, that I will not be able to reference them all. I'm going to talk about famous songs, but I'm also going to talk about rarities. And, I'm going to split this episode into two parts. So in this episode, we're going to look at the years 1960 to 1966. And in the second episode, it'll be 1967 to 1969. I will try to put some music clips in the video, but the really well-known bands probably won't get any music clips because I would get a copyright strike. So, sorry, no music clips by the Beatles. Now, starting in 1960, this was kind of hard for me to find examples of distorted guitar. There were some, but at a mainstream level, we actually see a lot of the original rock and roll singers were no longer in the spotlight. You had people like Elvis going to the army and Chuck Berry going to jail. And, there was this more kind of saccharine teen music that was now on the charts. I'm thinking things like Fabian or Pat Boone. And, there still were the last remnants of rockabilly, and there was the beginnings of garage rock. There were these kind of instrumental bands. And, there were some interesting studio experiments. There was a great kind of distorted sound on Go On Home by Sanford Clark. And the guitar player Al Casey, who played on this track, did create a distorted sound.
Oh, will you say you're gonna cut me?
And there's some real energetic rock and roll songs, too. Another song from 1960 that still has that, late 50s rock and roll energy is I Fought the Law. Now, you might be more familiar with the Bob Fuller 4 or the Clash version, but the original version was done by the Crickets in 1960. Now, yes, this is the same backing band for Buddy Holly, who passed away in 59, and they recorded this song with Sonny Curtis on vocals.
Hot sun, I fought the law and the law won. I fought the law and the law won.
Now, what's interesting is that rockabilly and rock and roll was really having a renaissance in the United Kingdom in 1960 and the early 1960s years. And, a lot of the 1950s rock and rollers were touring regularly in the United Kingdom. But what's also interesting is the Island Nation was putting together their own bands, and one of them was Johnny Kidd and the Pirates. And Johnny Kidd actually had an eye patch like a pirate, and they would release a really great rock and roll track called Shaking All Over. Now, while the guitar is not distorted per se, it's so reverb soaked that it's really got a punch, a real edge in the sound. But what's interesting is one place where distortion would show up would be on a country and western track in 1960. When recording a guitar for the Marty Robbins song, Don't Worry, Grady Martin's guitar, it actually became distorted because of a faulty channel in the mixing board, but it was kept in the original track because it was like this cool novelty of a sound, this kind of fuzzy sound. And it was a hit when it was released in 1961, the following year. So Grady Martin decided to cash in on this novelty effect and managed to recreate this sound in the studio. And the song was called The Fuzz. Now, this manipulation of sound would be the basis for the Maestro F1 fuzz tone guitar pedal. Now, this pedal would be used the following year on the Ventures track 2,000 Pound B. The effect was throughout the song. You've got that kind of venture staccato guitar, and it was actually the single was in two parts, so there's a part one and a part two. Now, this was the era of the instrumental bands, and the Ventures were the sort of top group in playing in that style. But they weren't the only ones, and one of the most ferocious approaches to guitar playing was heard on another track in 1962. Dick Dale, he was also playing a kind of surf rock, and he used a really fast staccato style that was influenced by his father's Lebanese heritage, and the experiences he had when he felt like waves washing over him when surfing. So, having seen the piece Miserlou, it's a song that has a tradition in the Middle East and Balkan countries. He saw it being played on the oud, the Middle Eastern instrument once. Dale created a version on his Stratocaster guitar. Now, the result was an intense guitar piece played with, again, that powerful reverb sound. I mean, this is sort of the basis of where you get a lot of the instrumental stuff that you would hear in like heavy metal decades later. Now, this song, of course, became more well known in the 90s because of the Pulp Fiction soundtrack. And there's a really wild other song that stands out called Scream by Ralph Nielsen and the Chancellors. Now, it's a fast-paced track, with this kind of frantic surf guitar, but throughout the track, there's this girl just screaming. I mean, this track is pure punk rock energy.
Get on screaming, get on screaming, get on screaming,
And, there'll be a lot of other energetic songs, particularly going into 1963. A really great one is The Girl Can't Dance by Bunker Hill. And this is just ferocious rhythm and blues with really, really raspy, powerful vocals that, again, we would hear in hard rock and heavy metal in the next decade.
You know not everybody talking mama girl can't dance, she's mine, all mine. You know not everybody talking mama girl can't dance, she's
Now, a completely insane track from 1963 is Surfer Bird by the Trashmen. If you've never heard this, you really need to hear it. It is just wild. But the UK was also producing stuff. There was this shocking track called Jack the Ripper by Screaming Lord Sut. She was one of the early sort of shock rockers, long before Arthur Brown or Alice Cooper, and he would actually dress up like Jack the Ripper. The song is really great. But there would be a song in 1963 that would really bring out the idea of the riff. And that, of course, is Louie Louie by the Kingsmen. Now, this song was originally done by Richard Berry in 1955, and there was another version done in 1961 by Rockin' Robin Roberts with the Wailers as the backing band. I could have maybe mentioned that for one of the songs in 1961. But it's the Kingsmen's version that really captured the imagination. The song, it's not about technical playing, but it's just about sheer enthusiasm and vigor, and it's done in that 1, 2, 3... 1, 2, 1, 2, 3 rhythm. And the song is sloppy yet amazing. It has this great chaotic guitar solo. There even might be some swearing when a drumstick gets dropped. And, the track was kind of dismissed at first. And Boston DJ played it as the worst single of the week. But as they say, there's no such thing as bad publicity, and the exposure had the opposite effect. And by December 1963, it reached number 2 on the charts. Now, this song would be an inspiration for those groups who were playing together across the country in various garages. You have this idea of something called garage rock. Now, the Kingsmen were from Portland, Oregon, and the Pacific Northwest was a hotspot for this kind of really rough garage rock. And in 1964, one of these bands would really kind of push the limit of this, and that, of course, was the Sonics. And in 1964, they released this heavy Little Richard-inspired single called The Witch. Again, this track is another proto-punk classic with a heavy kind of call and response sound.
say she's the witch.
But 1964 was the year of the British invasion. When the Beatles arrived in America in 1964, a phenomenon occurred that was arguably just as big or even bigger than the Elvis phenomenon of the 1950s. The success of the Beatles created an awareness of this sort of mass amount of British groups that there were, and that would influence garage rock sounds in the United States as well. Now, one of these British groups, the Kinks, will release 2 singles with some really distorted guitar sounds, You Really Got Me and All Day and All of the Night. They had a sound that was very distorted, and it was because guitarist Dave Davies actually slash the speaker cones with a razor. It would be this sound that would unleash the possibilities of distortion over the next few years. And you know, the Beatles themselves, even though they had this clean image, they released the track I Feel Fine in 1964, and it starts with the use of guitar feedback. Now, the last band I would like to mention from 1964 is the Yardbirds. Eric Clapton was using fuzz on his leads to accentuate the electric blues that he was playing, and this was demonstrated on the tracks on their live debut album, 5 Live Yardbirds. You know, feedback and distortion would be at the forefront of the rock revolution, and that heaviness would continue to evolve in 1965. On both sides of the Atlantic, guitarists were embracing fuzz, distortion, feedback, and riffs. Now, one song that was very successful that year was I Can't Get No Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones. It had a great fuzzy riff. Now, the Yardbirds would get a new guitarist after Eric Clapton left, and the new guitarist Jeff Beck was experimenting with the feedback and the fuzz, and this sound was exemplified on the single Heart Full of Soul, and also on their version of Train Kept It Rolling. But the British rock song that brought the heaviness in 1965 has to be My Generation by The Who. My Generation was a youth anthem, and this was punk rock long before Johnny Rotten. It had ferocious guitar and bass, even as a bass solo, drums. It brought a level of intensity never heard before in rock. And of course, another fantastic song from the UK was When the Night Falls by The Eyes. And it has this noisy guitar sound in the beginning that almost sounds like Sonic Youth. But over in America, the Sonics were still making noise, as best exemplified in the songs Psycho and Strychnine.
Well, I like the taste of straight strychnine.
1965 brought the fuzz-out guitar to the forefront. But it was in 1966 when the gates really opened. Fuzz pedals and the improvements in amplification allowed heavier sounds to be created. There are numerous tracks that represent this growth in distorted sound. There was also numerous garage rock songs that increased the intensity. And also, there's the emergence of psychedelic music with feedback and, incorporating music forms from around the world and even jazz sounds. Now, if you want to talk about garage rock, there's a couple of great examples of American garage rock. And let's look at It's Trash by the Cavemen. That's got a completely noisy, chaotic sound. And Hang Up by the Wailers, which is just a savage garage rocker. Now, some of these songs actually got to be more well-known in 1966, and the more well-known songs had that heavy edge. And I'm thinking about something like Talk Talk by the Music Machine, or Count 5, Psychotic Reaction, or Pushing Too Hard by the Seeds. And these are all kind of late psychedelic garage rock sounds. But in San Francisco, there's this idea of a psychedelic band, which is based on musicianship and being more cerebral. You got bands like the Jefferson Airplane, Quicksilver Messenger Service, The Great Society, and the Grateful Dead. And they're influenced by folk, but they're also influenced by jazz and like indie music, and they're doing these long extended guitar parts, which could be quite heavy at times. Now, one band that could have a quite heavy sound that was from that scene was Love, and they released 2 albums in 1966, the self-titled and De Capo. Now, their track 7 and 7'Is, it has an almost punk rock intensity.
When I was a boy, I thought about I'd be a man.
Now, one track that really emphasized the influence of indie music and jazz was East West by the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. Now, they had this extending solos and jams that would be a huge influence on heavy music later in the decade. But I gotta talk about some real strange groups that are now well known, but maybe weren't so much known at the time. And the first of these, of course, is the 13th Floor Elevators out of Austin, Texas. And they created this weird, obtuse, but ballsy psychedelic garage rock that had these fierce screams by Roky Erickson, and they also had like an electric jug as an instrument. Their debut album, The Psychedelic Sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators, came out in November 1966. Really, definitely check that out. And then there was this American band that was based in Germany called the Monks. And they played some absolutely crazy experimental music. It was like an avant-garde garage rock, complete with an electric banjo. And the music was just drenched in distortion and absurdism. Their only album, Black Monk Time, was released in 1966. They even dressed like medieval monks with that, monk hairstyle, the tonsure. They cut their hair like that. And then, of course, Frank Zappa releases his first album in 1966. And his band, The Mothers of Invention, the album was Freak Out. And they're combining like noise rock with 20th century classical music concrete, samples, and all kinds of strange stuff. And a particularly strange, noisy track from that album is Who Are the Brain Police. Now, that album would be hugely influential on many bands in the next few years. Now, there's noisy garage rock bands that are coming out of the UK too. And later on, this term for these kind of bands would be freak beat. Two really raw sounding singles from 1966 would be Red Sky at Night by The Accent and She Got Eyes That Tell Lies by Him and the Others. But there was, heaviness that was starting to permeate very successful singles in the United Kingdom. Of course, if we're going to talk riffs, we got to talk about Wild Thing by the Trogs, which was a huge hit. And it had a riff kind of similar to Louie Louie, but the timing's a little different. And one great guitar track by the Beatles, Paperback Writer, was released that year, and it has just fierce guitar work on there. And then heaviness is also the darkness of the subject matter. And the Rolling Stones released two songs that year that had that dark, menacing tone. I'm thinking Paint It Black and Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby, Standing in the Shadows. And, Eric Burdon and the Animals had a great dark tune called When I Was Young. I mean, even really poppy songs like Hold Tight by Dave, D, Dozy, Beaky, Mick, and Titch had some heavy sounds in the track. But however, when you're looking at heavy music, it's got to be about the people who are the guitar masters, people who are doing the solos. And out of the UK, you have people like Jeff Beck. He continued his progression and feedback and strings, bending unique sounds that would be the foundation of 70s rock. 3 singles released by the Yardbirds that year capture this sound. Shape of Things Before My Eyes, Over, Under, Sideways Down, and Happenings 10 Years Time Ago. Now, that later single also had the famous studio musician Jimmy Page on guitar. And these two guitarists would play for around 6 months together, and they'd make some really intense sounds. There's actually great footage of the two guitar crates playing together in the film Blow Up, and they play a song called Stroll On. Now, Beck would leave the group by the end of the year, and Page would take over the band. Now, I will definitely talk about that in the next episode. And the last band I want to talk about is Cream. Cream was formed when former bluesbreaker and Yardbird guitarist Eric Clapton joined with bassist vocalist Jack Bruce and drummer Ginger Baker. The band would take blues, merge it with psychedelia, and with their high-level musicianship, created the foundation on which hard rock would be based. Arguably, they are the first rock band. The intense, long soloing would be influential also on future heavy metal bands. Debut album, Fresh Cream, was released in December 1966. The album is arguably the first rock album again, so we're not rock and roll anymore, we're rock. Very much based in the heavy blues. Some highlight tracks include NSU, Spoonful, Rolling and Tumbling, I'm So Glad, and the US release included their single, I Feel Free. So, in these years from 1960 to 1966, we went from the last stages of sort of the 50s rock and roll and rockabilly all the way to kind of rock in 1966. And there's this progression and distortion, feedback, and just overall heaviness. But it would be the progression in the last 3 years of the decade that would be even greater. Please tune into the next episode. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and or comment. And let me know some of your favorite songs from 1960 to 1966. Thank you.